Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge, not wholly or in full measure, but very substantially. At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom. Good evening, distinguished guest, Dr. Aditya Sondhi, faculty members of La Polity, and the students who have joined us from all over the country. 15th August 1947, India set itself free from 2 centuries of colonial rule. As we gather celebrating 75 years of India's independence, let us remember the great sacrifices of our ancestors and take an oath to dedicate ourselves to the service of this great nation. Before we proceed with our event, here are the guidelines for the participants. The participants are requested to keep themselves on mute until asked to unmute. All questions are to be put up in the chat box only, and the participants are requested to switch on their cameras if possible. I would now like to invite our staff advisor, Dr. Rupinder Oberoi, to carry forward the event.
Thank you, Yashasvi, for this organizing this event on behalf of La Polity, Department of Political Science, Hiroshima College. And good evening to all, and a very warm welcome to Dr. Aditya Sondhi. And thanks a lot, sir, for accepting our invitation to being with us and agreeing to deliver a talk on this very relevant and pertinent topic of democracy and political representation in India since independence. I also take this occasion to introduce Dr. Aditya Sodhi, who is our keynote speaker for today evening. Dr. Aditya Sodhi has a wonderful amalgamation of degrees, which is very well suited to our department and also to the theme on which we're going to talk today for about an hour or so. Dr. Aditya Sodhi is a senior advocate and is practicing before High Court, Karnataka, and also the Supreme Court of India. He has served as an additional advocate general for Karnataka from the year 2016 to 2018. Dr. Aditya Sodhi has taught constitutional law, professional ethics, corporate law, arbitration at the National Law School of India University, of which he himself is a graduate. He also holds, a master's degree in political science and was awarded with PhD by the University of Mysore. He has lectured widely in India and abroad, and I personally saw some of those videos on YouTube. A very articulate speaker, very precise, and very well, addresses the issues, which I had the privilege of watching some of his videos, which are there on the YouTube. And also he's published 2 works on nonfiction with Penguin India. So on behalf of La Polity, Department of Political Science, a very warm welcome once again.
Thank you.
Regarding the theme of the webinar, we decided to, themize this evening on democracy and political representation in India, but we also wanted to recapitulate, sort of sum up how we have fared in terms of 7 decades of our independence, particularly vis-a-vis the democracy and representation. There is no doubt that the idea of democracy and representation and its concomitant challenges it is confronting today. We are particularly bogged down by issues, for example, political degeneration, extreme polarization, factionalism, and also political, communal, ethnic divides, the rise of the identity politics, and it's happening globally. We often contextualize the debate within India, but I would say that there is a global rise of identity politics. And we have also not been able to solve some of the, very, very stubborn and wicked problems of economic and social disparities. And so it becomes very significant that as we celebrate 2 days from now, the Independence Day, how do we, especially as an academic institution and as a student and how do we decode, how do we understand, how do we break down, and how do we appraise and assess this journey of ours, which, in my view, has had its own, the benefits and drawbacks. And it's very interesting that we're talking about the issue today. And just last evening, the media was splashed with this debate and discussion about how nasty the parliamentary democracy itself can become. It was embroiled with controversy. The monsoon session was washed away. We spend, so much of money on the parliamentary session. So how do we understand these issues has become very, very important as a student of political science, I would say. And there's also these charges of muzzling of democracy, shrinking of the public sphere, to use the Habermasian term here, institutional capture, rampant corruption. And all these actually combine to downsize and devalue democracy and representation to mere technicality. And this again underscores the urgency, I would say, to guard, fortify, to reinforce the democratic architecture. And as we know that the democratic representation and political participation is quintessential ingredients for efficacious, and also to root this concept of deep democracy or substantive democracy, to move away from just procedural democracy. And political representation in that sense is also a fundamental medium of communication. It's a means of interface between the state and the citizens. And it is also sometimes referred to in a very corporate language, which Dr. Sondhi would be aware of, principal-agent relationship kind of thing can also be alluded to the participation and political representation of the modern democracy. So over the years, however, we also see that the idea of representation has become very complex, challenging, problematic. Legitimate and authentic representative channels, which could uphold the earnest public policy decision-making processes, have been captured by the vested interests. And the political self-determination has not really translated into inclusive society or egalitarianism. More often than that, the political survival and the power grabbing by the political party has become a primary agenda, rather than reflecting the needs or articulating the needs, triumphs and letdowns of the Indian democracy as we have evolved over the 7 decades. So to throw light on these issues, to discuss and provide this very a specialist and expert insight into some of the questions that I have described at the beginning, I invite Dr. Aditya Sondhi to come and talk to us about these issues. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Sondhi.
Thank you very much, Dr. Oberoi, for that introduction and that powerful set of comments that you've made. My thanks to La Politique and the Kirorimal College for having extended this invitation to me. I would have liked to have addressed you in person, but sadly circumstances don't permit that. But for me, this invitation is doubly special because my mother was a graduate of Delhi University, perhaps in the early 60s. And therefore I feel privileged to be speaking to you today. And thank you once again for this kind invitation. Now, the topic is delightfully broad. It has many parameters, and Dr. Oberoi has in fact touched upon several of them. I will try and address some of those. I am thankful that you have left it to me to approach this topic in a manner suitable to the theme. And I would try and wear multiple hats while addressing this topic. Of course, to an extent, as a lawyer and a student of constitutional law, I will make some comments on our constitutional architecture that enables democracy. But I will also speak to you as a student of political theory, as also as a citizen, and try and traverse some dimensions of this very broad and fascinating topic. My initial take on this topic is in my capacity as a student of political science directly related to my thesis that I submitted to the Mysore University, for which I was awarded a doctorate, which was on the interface between the army and democracy. Now, I want to first say to you that nothing I'm saying to you today is absolutist, in the sense that I will speak to you about institutions and the concept of democracy in India, not to say that they are faultless, but try to commend to you what attributes they have, which may have enabled the growth of democracy in India as we understand it today. And my topic looked at a slightly lesser studied element of the growth of democracy, at least in India, which is the role of the military. You see, civil-military relations in Pakistan, and mine was a comparative study of India and Pakistan, is far sharper in discussion and study in Pakistan simply because of decades of military rule that have interspersed Pakistan's history. In India, in some ways, it is regarded as a non-issue, simply because we have been fortunate enough never to have experienced military rule in our history. But I do believe that many times non-events define history as sharply as events themselves. And when we speak of political representation after independence, we must remember that independence was that cutoff when both India and Pakistan came to be. How is it then that we have moved in such divergent trajectories? I think is a question worth discussing when we understand the concept of political representation. Political representation can be more easily understood in a very literal sense of an electorate and an elected representation. But I, as a student of political theory and constitutional theory, would rather look at the infrastructure and the historical scenario which enabled political representation in India with its flaws. And I think there the understanding of the role of passive institutions becomes crucial in my respectful understanding. Of course, we give credit to hard institutions as they're known. We give credit to the Election Commission, to the bureaucracy, to the Supreme Court, to the media, and several others in the role played in the growth of democracy. But I want to talk to you first and foremost about the role of the military in these circumstances. Again, not in an absolutist sense. Of course, the military has its own criticisms to answer. But from this perspective, how is it that a common army, we were after all a common army at independence, how is it that a common army and soldiers and officers born of a common stock have taken on such divergent political identities? I think is a question worth reflecting on. You see, officers at the cusp of independence, in fact, pretty much after the Second World War, Indian officers were regarded highly for the role that they played, and in many ways were groomed in the British mold of being officers and gentlemen. In fact, there was a certain elitist touch even to the armed forces in those days. Most commissioned officers were products of good public schools, of good military academies. They went to, the IMA, or not even the IMA, the RIMC, Dehradun, Sandhurst in the UK, and had a certain cutting edge about them. And this was common to the early stock of both Indian and Pakistani officers. And at the heart of that training, as it were, was the need to stay apolitical. That armed forces had no business in politics, and politics was in fact a taboo subject even in the mess. In a military mess, an officer would be scorned if he, and I say he because at that point I believe they were all male officers, if he discussed politics over supper or lunch or a cup of coffee. And that tradition, in fact, in many ways, has influenced the outcome as far as India is concerned. I don't say that's the only reason, but that has been an ethos that has remained true of the armed forces in India to a large extent. But before I comment upon that aspect, let's take a quick look at what happened in Pakistan at its inception. You see, Pakistan in many ways was Jinnah's brainchild. He had a vision to try and replicate a form of democratic governance in Pakistan as well. But he was found short on 2-3 accounts. Firstly, he didn't have the team. He didn't have the tradition of civilian governance and even well-trained lawyers who had a sort of civilian constitutional instinct to governance. He didn't have that backing with him. Secondly, he passed away early, as we know. And Pakistan was therefore left in the lurch. It didn't have elections early enough. Compare that to India, where we had our constitution by 1950. We had our first general election in 51, 52. And therefore, the electoral experiment, what we take for granted today when we speak of political representation and democracy, that was an experiment at that time, was well underway, with the benefits of having a certain civilian tradition, a Congress party that had tall leaders, and also a sort of a suspicion of the role of the military. But in Pakistan, these were all starkly absent. Pakistan had therefore executive officers in governance, contrary to what many of us think of Pakistan as a sort of a monolith, as a sort of a unidimensional Muslim state. It's in fact anything but that. Pakistan is divided along many other lines, sectarian lines at the foremost. Language is a big deal in Pakistan, and ethnicity, feudal lines, territorial, provincial lines. And all of those cracks in the joints started to play out soon after independence because there was no real form of constitution or constitutional governance that could call the shots. So there were many power centers. There were strong religious leaders. There were very strong feudal leaders. There were sectarian demands. There was a Mohajir population from India that had migrated to Pakistan, which was seen as Urdu speaking and different from the Punjabi and Sindhi speaking and the Pakhtuns of Pakistan. So there were many, many pulls in that relatively smaller state. And that naturally led to law and order situations very early in Pakistan's history. The army, surprisingly enough, was seen as a patriotic and a nationalistic institution, which was the only institution that functioned in the minds of the people. You see, the army was also seen as patriotic and nationalistic in India. But there it was seen in a more political avatar, because it was in a strange way seen as a sort of savior. And it became that savior because very early in its history, the army was invited to deal with law and order situations arising out of this very same sectarian violence that I spoke of. A job that actually a police department must do. It's not the business of the army per se to be involved in matters of internal governance and law and order. But here was a case where the army was invited, it did its job. There was no tradition, there were no tall civilian leaders. People were desperate in a sense to see someone showing the way. And ironically enough, the army was it. And in the absence of a constitution, their constitution came only in 1956. Now, 6 years after us and almost 10 years after independence. In a 75-year span, it may not seem like much, but at the beginning and at the time of independence, that's a very, very significant period of time. And to have gone almost 10 years without a constitution, without an appropriately elected government, and with the paradox of having the army in power, I think was fatal in a way for the concept of democracy in Pakistan. And ever since, the rest is history, as they say, ever since there has been a cyclical return to military rule. Perhaps now for the first time after a long time, you have seen a slightly elongated stint of civilian democratic governance, but it's nowhere near what a constitutional democracy would aspire to. And obviously the army, with all the things that I said at the beginning, the professionalism, the apoliticalism, etc., that they were bred on, once they tasted power, then obviously there was no looking back as far as the armed forces were concerned. And you will see very fascinating studies by scholars such as Aisha Siddiqa and others who speak about the military and business interests coming together, the whole sort of military industrial access and the very strong real estate, land banks, etc., that the army owns in Pakistan. So over a period of time, it became a separate sort of government in its own sense. And I don't really want to spend too much time speaking about the experience in Pakistan, except to say that over the years, it remains an irony in Pakistan that their most democratic leaders have been regarded from the military top brass. So General Yahya Khan is attributed for having conducted what is regarded as the most democratic election in the history of Pakistan, in a sense. What a great irony. General Asif Nawaz, the New York Times described him as a champion of democracy. So to have an army general spoken of with those accolades, and which accolades were missing when it came to the civilian leaders. The irony is that leaders like Bhutto Senior, even Benazir Bhutto, Nawaz Sharif, have all been accused of being either autocratic or corrupt or both. And that does not sit well with the concept of a political representation in a democracy. Now compare this to the Indian experience. The armed forces were the same, as I said. They obviously were far from being involved in politicking in early Indian history. In fact, Nehru and his advisors were very wary of the armed forces. And part of that reason was what was happening in Pakistan simultaneously. Look, the history we take for granted at that time was playing out live. Now, if you were seeing Pakistan being subjected to martial law under Field Marshal Ayub in the early 50s, naturally the civilian government here was going to be slightly suspect of its own position, because nothing could have been taken for granted at that time. So in a sense, the generals were kept away. Field Marshal Karyappa, in fact, I don't know how many of you know this, contested an election after his retirement, because he felt that there was a greater role for the armed forces, maybe not in a literal political sense, but certainly he felt that the chiefs deserved a better voice at the political high table, which was lacking at the time. And the proof of that, in a sense, was what happened in 1962 with the Indochina War. That was not so much a military defeat as it was a political military failure internally for India. And again, I don't have much time to go into history, but this has been one of the most interesting chapters that I researched in the course of my thesis, because it showed the very sharp cracks between the military establishment and the civilian establishment. And you had then a defense minister in Krishna Menon, who was actually a brilliant mind, but extremely suspicious of the army. He had his favorites within the army. He didn't get along too well with General Thimaia. They were sort of both alpha males. There were ego issues. And General Thimaia was very highly regarded in the armed forces. The people loved him. And when he put in his papers as the chief, because of the constant interference by Krishna Menon, I mean, that was a political storm. Of course, Pandit Nehru prevailed upon him to withdraw his resignation. But the message had already been communicated that the civilian government was interfering in matters of appointments of chiefs. The last trigger, in fact, for Thimaia was when his recommendations for army chief were superseded by the civilian establishment. But long story short, this period was quickly followed by the China War. 61 is when General Thimaia resigned, and he had warned of the Chinese incursion, but he was never taken seriously. The civilian government saw Pakistan as the serious threat. China, as you know, Hindi, Chini, bhai bhai, we were lulled into a comfort that China would never attack us, and China obviously knew what was happening on the ground. And my point is that something like 1962 and the breakdown of the trust deficit that took place between the civilian military government which actually had an impact on our national morale and identity, is the sort of thing that would straight away trigger a military coup in Pakistan. In fact, coups in Pakistan have happened for a lot less. And I say this in my paper, 62, the 1975 emergency, Operation Blue Star, when the Indian armed forces were brought into, attacking and evicting the Golden Temple precincts and the Gurudwara, led in fact by Sikh officers to their credit, Operation IPKF, Kargil. Many of these have been, could have been, have not been, but could have been triggers in Indian political history where there could have been a serious questioning of the civilian government at the hands of the Indian armed forces. But that didn't happen. Please don't assume that it never happened even behind closed doors. A lot of my research has shown me that there was great discontent. During the emergency, the army chiefs were practically in, the military chiefs were practically in house arrest. There was a lot of friction in the ranks. But for a variety of reasons, it did not, and I thank God that it did not precipitate into a political confrontation between the armed forces and the government. And therefore, I want to flag this as a crucial starting point in our understanding our concept of democracy, that you have had passive institutions that have created political space, the sort of space that we assume was always there, but in fact may not have been there. That's not to say that it's all to the credit of the armed forces. There are multiple reasons. Maybe on another day I will speak to you. There are multiple reasons why the army did not, and in fact could not, have conceived of any sort of political adventurism. And that's also to do with the fact that the legitimacy was lacking. You see, there were other institutions that had already asserted themselves in the interregnum, not least the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, by the 80s, had become far more activist and dominant than it was hitherto. And in the understanding of Indian constitutionalism, we had already reached a stage where institutions, checks and balances, a spirit of the constitution, civilian democracy were all mantras that we took for granted. Now, in that background, the question of an armed force having any political role, frankly, was out of the question. India is a larger country, much larger country than Pakistan. The armed forces, I think, would be spurned if they sought to undertake any political experiment. But credit where it's due, that in the face of repeated incitement, for the want of a better word, the armed forces did play a restrained role for multiple reasons, creating a space in the Indian political system which has enabled the growth of democracy. And therefore, I would urge you, in your understanding of the concept of democracy 75 years after independence, we are now into our 75th year, to pay heed to these passive institutions, as it were, which have also played a role in the growth of democracy as we understand it. Because that space is what really ties up with political representation. I mean, where is the question of having political representation in a democracy? After a democracy is when we speak of a democracy, we speak of a legitimately elected government, right? And when we speak of that, then we have to pay heed to circumstances of the sort that I have mentioned to you now. Now, I spoke to you also about constitutionalism and the role of the Supreme Court. And I want to say to you here, I will try not to make the rest of my lecture to you legal heavy, but I still do need to give you my thoughts on the sort of constitutional apparatus and the architecture, a word that Dr. Oberoi used, the architecture that we have sought to create for ourselves to have a meaningful constitutional democracy with all its challenges and shortcomings. Now, the Indian Constitution itself is exhaustive in its description of this architecture. Remember, we are not just independent or celebrating Independence Day, we're also a republic. A republic goes many steps further than an independent nation, right? We speak of countries going independent sometimes in the erstwhile USSR or in Africa and so on, but minus the constitutional support system that they deserve. And you see many of them quickly slipping into dictatorship, into carnage, into ethnic cleansing, into violence, into war even. But when we speak of our status as a republic, we are essentially referring to our status as a country governed by a constitution. And it is the interpretation of this constitution by the Supreme Court over the decades that has made for interesting and marked doctrines. And the doctrine of the basic structure, which the Supreme Court developed after the Keshwanand Bharti case, to try and convey it to you in gist, I'm sure many of you are already aware of it, but essentially says that no government can amend the constitution so as to erode or deface its basic structure. So it's a very wide power of amendment that the constitution in fact gives to parliament under Article 368. It's almost a plenary power. Of course, it has checks and balances. When amendments affect the rights of the states, then the states must ratify them. You must have read about this recently in the context of the multi-state cooperative societies, where the Supreme Court said the ratification of the states is a must. You would have seen that debate also in the context of the Maratha reservation issue, where the Supreme Court said that it was in fact the union government that had the say when it came to notifying OBCs for the state, which was not a position hitherto. It was something that came about by constitutional amendment. But in that context of developing this concept of the basic structure, you see, it's not enough for a court to say basic structure cannot be violated. You then have to say what that basic structure is. The Indian Constitution does not tell us what its basic structure is. We know it as it's a long document. It has over 300 articles. And in many ways, every part is as important as the other. Of course, we know as practicing lawyers that some parts have become more equal than the others. For example, the chapter on fundamental rights, the parts relating to the enforcement of legal remedies, your right to go to the Supreme Court or the High Courts, etc., I believe, have pulled their weight. They've become stronger and more robust in a sense, because they, after all, breathe life into a democracy. When you speak of a constitutional democracy, it means that you're speaking of a democracy that recognizes and enforces the rights of its citizens. And when you do that, but naturally, some parts of the constitution become more equal than the others. And this onus falls on the Supreme Court repeatedly to tell you what is its basic structure. And that is a long list over the years. That list has been expanded: judicial independence, preamble, federal structure, fundamental rights, and importantly, democracy. You see, the Indian Constitution does not say democracy is its basic structure. We just assume it does, right? In a colloquial sense. But the Supreme Court, and interestingly, it was in S.R. Bomai's case. In fact, Mr. S.R. Bomai's son, Mr. Baswaraj Bomai, has recently become the new Chief Minister of Karnataka. And he spoke of his father's role. His father was, in fact, in the JD, in the Janata Dal. And his father's role in pursuing this case. You must all, even not as lawyers, as political scientists, read the judgment in S.R. Bomai. It was, in fact, a case that he could have given up because of subsequent political developments, but he stood his ground on principle. And that judgment, in fact, clearly codified that democracy is part of the basic structure. And what that importantly does is, it shifts democracy from a populist understanding to a constitutional understanding. It's not democracy in a simplistic electoral sense. It's now democracy in a constitutional sense. Once it is democracy in a constitutional sense and elevated to that status of a basic structure of the constitution, then it becomes beyond reproach. It goes beyond the realm of tinkering or amendment or dilution. And I believe that that's an important facet of our identity as a constitutional democracy. I think the paradox in some ways is that though democracy is part of the basic structure, the right to vote is not a fundamental right. You see, in fact, my paper that I submitted for the Oxford University Press compendium on the Indian Constitution was on elections. It's not a topic that I'm extremely well versed with in some ways. And I had said this to my editors who commissioned me also, that I drew the shortest straw and I could think of 10 other topics that I would have preferred to write on, but I was given elections and so be it. But while studying that topic, there were 3 or 4 revelations that came to me, that you've got democracy as a basic structure in India constitutionally, but you don't have a fundamental right to vote. In fact, the Constitution under Article 326 makes a reference to a right of a citizen to be registered as a voter, subject to that person meeting the qualifications and not being disqualified under the statute, meaning the Representation of the People's Act. And as you know, that act has very detailed provisions on how you can register as a voter, what criteria you need to meet, and what disqualifies you to be a voter, etc. Apart from that, there is no other mention of the right to vote. And therefore, the question remains, and it remains till this day, as to why the right to vote is not seen or treated as a fundamental right. And the Supreme Court has, in fact, repeatedly been troubled by this question. And you will find judgments which say that it's a constitutional right. A constitutional right is not the same thing as a fundamental right. There are judgments which say it's simply a statutory right. Now, if it's simply a statutory right under the Representation of People's Act, does that mean tomorrow you can amend the Representation of People's Act and delete provisions relating to voting? Then what democracy is it? And this is a real paradox, that you are a basic structure under the Constitution, but the right to vote per se is somewhere in limbo. Then came the question of nota, none of the above, which the Supreme Court upheld and said that it was part of your fundamental right to expression. Again, I see that as an interesting paradox, because your right not to elect somebody has been recognized by the Supreme Court as part of your fundamental right under Article 19(1)(a) to freedom of speech and expression. That's how important it is, which means voting is not a mechanical process. It's not just you and me going and standing in the queue and getting our fingers inked. It's in fact an expression, a freedom of our expression in choosing someone. But ironically, when it comes to nota, it is part of 19(1)(a), which is a negative act of not electing anyone. But when it comes to the positive act of electing someone, it's not yet a fundamental right. It's not yet recognized as part of 19(1)(a). And this was one of the revelations to me in my research. I'm quite certain that in the days or the years to come, this issue will also be settled, I think, emphatically by the Supreme Court. But till that happens, there is a sort of flux when it comes to the understanding of this right to vote. Also, political parties. Political parties are in a way the lifeblood of the political system, the electoral system that we speak of, right? We don't have a presidential form of election where we vote individuals, we vote parties in a sense, especially when it comes to the general election or even a state election for that matter. You vote candidates from parties. You have different candidates from each constituency. And therefore, in a sense, you are expected to be voting a party into power in a democratic system where the party in turn elects its leader. But political parties who are so crucially central to the process of political representation and election, both in terms of being voted in by the electorate and also themselves being at the helm of political power. See, political representation is not just me voting or someone being voted into power. It's both. If I am voting you in, then you are representing me. It's a two-way street. It takes two to tango. You can't discount one or the other. When we speak of the right to vote, we speak of the electorate. When we speak of political parties, we speak of the elected. And political parties also find no mention in the Constitution, with one exception, which came much later, when Schedule 10, which is what we commonly know as the anti-defection law, that for the first time in a schedule, not even in the main constitution, in the schedule, brought in a reference to a political party while explaining what defection is and what the consequences of defections, etc. are. But otherwise, something as central as a political party finds no mention in our constitution. Again, constitutionalism, democracy as basic structure, but something as central as a party not finding mention in the language of the constitution is an unusual occurrence. It can have different ramifications. You see, it can play both ways. Now look at what happened when the Right to Information Act was sought to be enforced against political parties. If you find no mention in the constitution, it's far easier for a political party to sit back and say, we are not a public authority. If you're not a public authority, you're not governed by the RTI Act. And in fact, the Central Information Commission years ago, must be 7-8 years now, 7-8 years ago said that political parties are indeed public authorities and are therefore amenable to RTI. They are obliged to disclose information that can be sought for under the right to information. Please see the web of rights that is either created or impacted. You have a right to vote. Of course, you have a right to vote, but voting only brings people to power. When we speak of political representation, I'm sure we also speak of accountability. We speak of continuing oversight, right? The process of election is not just going to vote every 5 years. It's what actually happens in between that's crucial to all of us. But here, political parties, and they were united in this, by the way, it's quite interesting. Every political party said, no, we are not a public authority. Now, had they been covered by the constitution, surely a constitutional authority is a public authority. I mean, that's too basic for me to drive home. But in the absence, you can say that a political party is central to governance and constitutionalism in India. In the same breath, you can say, no, but we're just a private outfit. We're like a club. We're a close-knit body. We're not answerable when it comes to seeking information about how we function, what are our accounts, etc., etc. And look, this I'm saying without any finger pointing. Every party took that view. And this again becomes an interesting revelation, as it were, in our political system. And when we're speaking of representation, we have to pay heed to these factors. There were a couple of other things, and I have some more time, so I will dwell on those as well. That came to my notice. You see, when I studied the topic of elections, I also looked at, of course, the institutional role, which is crucially important. I spoke to you already at length about the army, which is a passive institution, as it were. But when it comes to an active institution in the matter of democracy, it's the Election Commission. And conceptually, the Election Commission has a very strong hold under the Constitution. Political parties don't. Right to vote, no. But Election Commission, yes. So the agency that conducts the election has a constitutional status. Maybe the players don't as yet. The voters don't and the parties don't. But the umpire or the referee, as it were, has an elevated constitutional role. Article 324, etc. An election commissioner cannot be removed except by a process of impeachment. Impeachment is a remedy available only against constitutional functionaries, the president, Supreme Court, High Court judges. The powers of the Election Commission, what we refer to as the Model Code of Conduct, again, has no strict statutory basis, but the Supreme Court has said the Election Commission can do it. And I remember Mr. Qureshi, the former CEC, saying at a function where we were speaking, he said that Model Code of Conduct, whether it has legal teeth or not, is a secondary question. Because the breach of a model code, the filing of cases, etc., are all post facto events. Those are things that will happen after the election is over. and they may take their own sweet time, whether it's a civil case or a criminal case for breach of a model code is something post facto. But the existence of a model code at the time of the election is the crux in many ways, and I tend to agree with it, is that whether it has legal teeth adequately or not is besides the point. The existence of a model code does two very important things. One is it tells the voter what is expected of the candidate. And we are not a naive democracy. I do believe that Indian voters are nuanced, they are sensitive, they do understand. That's more true, I believe, in when it comes to the rural voter. They're a very hard-boiled electorate. And this model code does permeate not just the voters' consciousness, but also the candidates. A candidate is going to be concerned about bad press when a model code of conduct is violated, and that is carried, let us say, in the news because the Election Commission gives them a notice. And you would have seen this frequently, including in the recent West Bengal elections, where the Election Commission was frequently issuing notices to parties and to their candidates. You may wonder what came of that. Sometimes they would issue orders saying you can't campaign for 2 days, you can't campaign for a day, etc. Now, all of that creates a consciousness and a focus even on the candidate. And I do believe that not everything can be drummed out through the law. After all, you can't expect courts to be deciding every question. In fact, courts have a hands-off policy. Under the Indian Constitution, once an election is announced, courts don't interfere till the election takes place. And it's only after the election that courts can be approached by way of election petitions challenging the appointment of disqualified candidates, if there has been a corrupt practice, etc., etc. And therefore, I believe this institutional intervention by the EC also makes for more meaningful political representation. You may, of course, ask what the track record of the EC has been. Has it lived up to the standards expected of it, etc.? Valid questions to be asked. But historically, I do think that the EC has acquitted itself well. It's had a great logistical challenge. I mean, conducting an election, especially a general election in a country like India, is no mean task. And you've heard of anecdotes of there being one voter constituencies, etc., where election commission officers have to walk, through forests and streams, etc. I do believe that those are fascinating facets of our democratic process, and they may be anecdotal, but at the same time, they do add a bit of lifeblood to our understanding of the democratic process. I must say here also that while studying the concept of elections, I had occasion to look at, the sort of the preparation of electoral rolls, which is an important dimension, the delimitation of constituencies, and the very process of the election itself, when it comes to matters of hate speech, etc. Current issues that Dr. Oberoi highlighted in her introduction. And a lot of that does fall within the architecture of our constitutional legal framework, which funding, for example, like today, I can't say much about the question of electoral bonds because the matter is sub judice in the Supreme Court, but electoral funding is an extremely important facet of a robust and a transparent, what was the word that Gorbachev used to use, a glasnost, the transparency in a process. And electoral funding, I believe, has moved from an era of opacity to some transparency over the years. Today, over 20,000 rupees a donation must be disclosed. There are checks and balances and limitations on how much can be spent on an election, etc. And I do believe those are also important facets of a healthy democratic process when it comes to the actual election. I do want to say here, friends, that an important aspect of political representation is that we be represented by the right people and we be not represented by the wrong, to put it loosely. In this regard, I want to say to you, I have in fact, I play a role as we speak as an amicus curiae before the Karnataka High Court in a matter relating to criminal proceedings against elected MPs and MLAs. This is in fact something that the Supreme Court is overseeing in a pan-India proceeding, but matters have been remitted to the respective high courts to deal with the workings of the special courts that have been constituted for these offenses. And I can tell you it's a very important development in our democratic history, because it looks at the important aspect of criminal antecedents of elected leaders, right? Now, if a person is convicted of an offense which is referred to in the Representation of People's Act, he or she is liable to disqualification. But it's not just convictions, which is the end game, that has a bearing when it comes to making conscious choices as an electorate. Short of a conviction is also the question of pendency of criminal cases against candidates, right? And here the Supreme Court again deserves credit over the years for having made orders, including Justice Rohington's perhaps his last major order that he passed before his retirement a day ago, where the Supreme Court has directed political parties to once over make available the details of criminal antecedents of its leaders and their candidates separately. And that, I think, forms a very important part of our decision making, the awareness and the knowledge of the pendency of cases. Of course, I don't want to be too legalistic, because there is a world of difference between a complaint that is filed, say an FIR or a charge sheet, and a conviction. They are three completely different cases. I think of Navjot Sidhu's case. He was in fact convicted of that case of homicide. And he had to seek stay of that judgment in the Supreme Court in order to contest an election. Because if there was no stay of the judgment, he could not contest. Today he's in the forefront, as you know, in Punjab's elections. But he still has that, that matter has come to be disposed. But he had that sword hanging on him at the relevant time. And all of this, friends, becomes also a very important part of the oversight that I spoke to you about. The right that we have to be represented by the right people, right? And when I say that, I don't mean that only that a person without a criminal record automatically becomes right. No, I think there is a scope to also look at what Dr. Ambedkar had said. He had said it's not enough to say one man, one vote. To be gender correct, one woman, one vote. It is more important to have one woman, one value. Those were his words. Because a vote is only a political right. Forget about everything I said legally. As a citizen, a vote is a political right. But it ought to transmute into a socio-economic right. And I think that's where the question also still remains, that are we fairly represented when we speak of political representation? Do we have a sufficiently inclusive and diverse representation? You know, the conversation is on today about having reservation for women in Parliament. You already have reserved constituencies for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. I believe that's a step in the right direction. You're never going to have mathematical exactness when it comes to getting these things right, but you're certainly going to have representative exactitude when it comes to these matters. And when you've got a greater representation of those voices that are hitherto unheard, then you're getting closer to the concept of Dr. Ambedkar when he spoke of one vote, one value, so that every person has a value attached to him or her and not just a political right in a manner of speaking. I believe that is when our understanding of the notions of representation will become more nuanced and far more healthy. That's when we will be more representative, as it were. Also, are we represented by people like us? When I say people like us, I mean, I wanted to say younger leaders, but I realize I'm speaking to an audience that's probably half my age, and I'm kidding myself when I use the word young. But I still say that, do we have that representation? Are we developing a tradition of having younger leaders at the helm? Our party is giving more tickets to leaders who speak the voice of the youth, and that's a very different voice. You know that. You know that better than me. That the when it comes to election campaigns, the communication that a leader has to make to you might be very different from what he or she does to me, or say to someone who's from another generation. And let's also, friends, not look at democracy only in the context of a general election. That is your big ticket marquee event that happens every 5 years. But Indian democracy is much more than that. Indian democracy is the state elections that happen, the municipal elections that happen, the whole concept of Panchayati Raj. How important is that to the Indian democratic fabric? We speak about federalism. When you speak of federalism, then the role of the states becomes crucial as well. And federalism is part of the basic structure. So therefore, state elections, municipal elections, they all have their own pitching points, their own communications. And we've gone past that stage. I mean, there was a time when, you know, your pothole outside your road was not fixed and people used to say, oh yeah, central government bekar hai. But it's not the job of the central government or the member of parliament to fix your pothole. There is a delegation of powers. There is a bifurcation of powers. There is a job that a parliamentarian must do. There is a job that an MLA must do. There is a job that a municipal elected leader must do. And we can't forget or conflate those. Of course, parliamentary processes themselves, again, something that Dr. Oberoi referred to, the stalemate in parliament, how effectively are laws discussed in parliament, how effectively are legal issues, citizens issues, political issues discussed in parliament is also a very important part of political representation. It's what happens in between. You may have an elected government, you may have a strong elected government like ours, but you may still have the need, you do have the need for all of these processes to continue in between, so as to make political representation more effective. The role of the media in giving you and me a voice is not the media expected to speak up for us as much as it communicates to us what the government is doing, good, bad, ugly. It also ought to then speak to us, speak for us, and convey the feelings and the grievances and the congratulations and the accolades, etc., of its people. Only then is political representation to be fully understood in the context of a constitutional democracy. And therefore, friends, with these words, I want to once over thank you for inviting me and conclude by saying that we ought to understand the institutional role when we look at democracy in India. And I know I'm speaking to a batch of bright students from the political science department. So in many ways, maybe I'm saying the obvious, but the role of the institutions, the role of passive institutions, as I mentioned to you, the concept of constitutionalism, and the ongoing exercises within the democratic space are what really make for political representation to be meaningful. I've said to you that we're not just a democracy, but we're not just an independent state, but we're a republic. And when we understand our democracy in that light, only then will political representation come to have the deeper meaning that is expected of it. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much, sir, for that great and engaging webinar. It was indeed a very insightful way to enlighten us through the topic. So here we come at the end of our event. Now I invite upon Dr. Rupinder Oberoi, Staff Advisor, La Polity, to deliver the vote of thanks. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Aditya Soni, for this very insightful and incisive perspective and lecture, and really sort of walking us through this immensely complex historical, theoretical, institutional, and legal underpinning and nuances of representation, constitutionalism, constitutional democracy, and also sort of dwelling upon the inviolability and the sanctity of the legal pillars of the fundamental structures, or the basic structure, as you referred to, of the Indian democracy. I would say that you actually, in a span of about 60 minutes, covered the entire canvas and flagging all the vital questions and issues and topics needed for the preliminary or primary understanding of democracy and the political representation. Your deep understanding as an advocate was also very handy for us to understand particularly the role of Supreme Court, judiciary as an impartial arbiter between the legislature and the executive, and you contextualize it with giving example of electoral process and elections and so on. It was equally, I would say, very, very fascinating because you began your talk with this very discerning comparative study of the military class, both in India and in Pakistan. And in a way, you contextualize the stories of the two newly independent, I would say, newly independent nations and the path they chose. And the path they chose and walked upon for nearly 7 decades or so now. So it was really, really wonderful to have you to speak to us. And I think the students gained a lot from your expertise, from your specialization. And also, I would particularly like to thank you for sparing the time from this very, very busy schedule which you have. I truly appreciate that. I also would like to thank the organizing committee, the Law Polity Council students, the faculty of the KMC, and the students also who participated in the event and also asked this very, very interesting and very, very fascinating questions which allowed the discussion to move forward. So thanks a lot. Have a great evening and happy Independence Day on 15th August.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you.